Okay, Todd and I were talking about doing something about militarism and came up with the idea of looking a little bit at GI resistance and then military counter recruitment, and then we'll have a discussion about ideas of things that we can do to encourage both of those ideas. The United States and any country can't very well have wars if they don't have a military. I wrote a pamphlet one time, and the opening line of the pamphlet was that Hitler's arms were only 3 feet long, so he couldn't have done what he did without the help of other people. And in getting ready for this, I discovered that there's more history of anti-militarism in the United States than I thought there was. Even during the colonial period, there were several times when the troops rose up. In fact, there were 3,000 troops that refused orders in Philadelphia in the 1780s. And at that time, when people enlisted in the Army, it was for a specific period of time. And when their time was over, they went home. They had farming to do. It didn't matter if they're in the middle of a battle. When their time was over, they was done. And I found this list, which is probably not comprehensive, but this is a list of pacifists and war resistors in the history. And they said religious pacifists during the French and Indian War, political moderates during the American Revolution, Francophile Republicans in the quasi-war with revolutionary France, 1789, Anglophile Federalists during the War of 1812, Transcendentalist dissent writers, academics, and abolitionists in the War with Mexico, Northern Copperheads, and a group I hadn't heard of before, Southern Anti-Confederates in the Civil War, the Anti-Imperialist League in the Spanish-American War, the Fellowship of Reconciliation and Women's Peace Party during World War I era, and the United World Federalists of the Second World War era. So there's always been some flavor of opposing the military in this country. During, like I said, there was a number of rebellions among the troops during the revolutionary colonial time. In 1840, when we invaded Mexico, the same situation of troops enlisting for a specific time was going on. And by the time that Zachary Scott got to Mexico City, he only had 1/3 of the size of troops that he started off with, because the people went back to their farms when their time was up. During the Civil War, troops in the North and the South did the same thing. They left when their time was up. Didn't matter what battle, and there were several 100,000 on both sides deserted during the Civil War. In the Philippines, the U.S. Army invaded and tried to take over the Philippines as part of the Spanish-American War. There were quite a number of mostly black American troops who deserted and joined the Philippine rebels because the rebels used the argument that here you are a person of color, what are you doing, trying to hold us down with your imperialist army? In 1917, the Congress passed the Selective Service Act, and I was surprised to read that 250,000 people who were supposed to sign up in 1917 refused to sign up and didn't sign up, and an additional 50,000 applied for deferment, which affected the first parts of the war. During the Second World War, there was a lot of dissent in the military, mostly because of racism. The black troops were given some of the worst assignments, and eventually they rose up in quite a number of places around the world, and Truman eventually, I think it was in 1948, ended segregation in the Army. At the end of the Second World War in 1945, troops in Europe and the Pacific were led to believe that the war's over, we're going to go home. We signed up for the duration. That was just the beginning of the U.S. empire, and the people in charge decided to use, instead of sending troops home, they would start the beginnings of the empire, transfer troops, especially from Europe to the Pacific, which caused a large rebellion in the U.S. military. There were 20,000 U.S. troops who marched in the Philippines, in Manila, and eventually the military gave in and allowed the troops to go home. And there's some thinking that because of the action of the troops at that time, the United States didn't, when we lost China, as it was said in the last workshop, the U.S. did not intervene in that situation because of the action of the troops just a few years earlier in showing their rebellious nature in the situation. So in 1949, we didn't get involved. In the Korean War, there were a number of American troops who deserted. There wasn't much outright dissent among the troops, but there were a number who deserted at the end of, when the armistice was signed. There were 21 U.S. troops who had been prisoners of war who preferred to stay in China rather than return to the United States, and the main reason they gave was the racism in the United States. In 1965, a West Point graduate was the first U.S. military person to be court-martialed for refusing to go to Vietnam as he was ordered. And one of the first enlisted people, I think was also in 1965, was someone who had been in the military and became a Jehovah's Witness, and because of that refused to be transferred to Vietnam, and he was court-martialed for that. I think that it's pretty clear that there were three things that ended the war in Vietnam. One was the fact that the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong were excellent, tenacious fighters who were protecting their home from a foreign invader. One was the people in the streets here who finally got upset enough to make a change in the policy. And the third, and which may be the biggest factor, which is lesser known, is that there was such a rebellion among the U.S. troops that the military didn't trust their own troops. There were at least 10 actual mutinies among U.S. troops. Fragging became fairly common after 1968. I read various numbers, but somewhere between 75 and 100 officers were killed by their own troops. There were somewhere in the neighborhood of 800 who were injured in fragging incidents. And the Department of Defense itself put out a report that said that 3% of the fatalities in Vietnam were as a result of troops firing on their officers, which would suggest that there have been as many as 1,500 who were killed. Drug use was rampant. When I was there in '68, I would guess that 80% of people smoked marijuana, 15% were drunk most of the time, and maybe 5% didn't imbibe. Within 2 years of that time, the records suggest that the use of heroin had increased to the point where about 45% of the troops in Vietnam were using heroin. That can be seen as a form of GI resistance the amount of AWOLs increased consistently every year from 1968. Prior to 1967, the amount of AWOL and desertion was a very small number. But starting in 1968, as opposition to the war increased, there was a significant increase in the number of people who were either not reporting for duty or leaving once they were supposed to be on duty. In 1966, a man named Andy Stapp, who was a student, he had become radicalized when he visited Egypt in '64 and saw how the British were oppressing the Egyptians. He started becoming radicalized. And he came back and went to school. He became a member of SDS and got involved in the anti-war movement. And he decided on a personal level that having protests in the street wasn't the most effective thing to do. So he joined the military and went through basic training and then was sent to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. And he started organizing the soldiers there. And eventually started the American Servicemen's Union, which supposedly had as many as 10,000 members at one time. They had at least 75,000 people who were reading their newspaper. Needless to say, the military wasn't pleased with him, and I think within a year or so he was court-martialed and thrown out of the service. But the American Servicemen's Union continued through to the early 70s as an effective force of GI counter-resistance. As the war in Vietnam moved from being mostly on the ground to sea and air war, the GI resistance shifted so that first the Navy started having problems. At that time, the Navy was probably the most racist of the military divisions. Only about 5% of those in the Navy were black, but they had the worst jobs. They had 3 times the number of judicial incidents with officers. So there was a seething amount of racism. And when you couple that with the Black Power movement and the stuff that was going on at home at that time, it started to come out. And in 1972, the USS Kitty Hawk had been on an 18-month cruise through the Pacific, was supposed to be coming home. The Forrestal and the USS Ranger were supposed to go and replace them in the Pacific. So the Kitty Hawk was at Subic Bay in the Philippines. Forrestal and Ranger were in San Diego. And as they were leaving, there were incidents of sabotage. 12-inch chain were dropped into the engine, causing millions of dollars of damage. And there were also racial uprisings. So both of those ships ended up going back to San Diego. And the Kitty Hawk, which was supposed to come home, the troops there were told they had to go back to the Vietnam area and continue their tour there, which totally upset the folks there. The racism had been under control, and that incident just basically brought it to the fore. And there were actual fights, large-scale brawls on the ship, the Kitty Hawk, at that time. And the Pentagon admitted that the reason that got so bad on the Kitty Hawk was because of the sabotage from the troops on the other 2 ships. So that was an instance in which it was shown there was a direct correlation between the sabotage and affecting the mission of the military. Along about the same time, a lot of the Air Force bombers were flying out of Guam and out of Thailand, and after a period of time, quite a number of the pilots there refused to do the flights because they started seeing that their missions were to bomb hospitals and civilian areas. And quite a number of them were court-martialed. And these were people that were highly decorated people. The bombing or the mining of Haiphong and Hanoi harbors was severely impacted by the fact that the people in the munitions factory or depot in the Philippines were taking the fuses out of the mines before they were going there, so they were totally ineffective. So there was a lot of types of sabotage and resistance that went on. It reached the point where in Vietnam, by the end of the war, they were locking up the guns and not letting the troops have access to the guns except when they had to go out on a specific mission. Because there were so many incidents of fragging and thousands of more incidents of threatening the soldiers, or threatening the officers. I know when I was there, after Tet of '68, people started questioning why we were there. I was in the infantry, and anytime anyone would come in as an officer or a higher NCO position who were trying to cheer us on, they were treated negatively. In fact, we had a sergeant major who he used to call Charlie those rascals. Let's go out and get those rascals. And they would want to send people out on just really stupid missions where you were likely to get killed. So at that time, like I said, 80% of us were stoned most of the time. We used to amuse ourselves by taking flares. They had it's in a aluminum tube, and you take the top off and you put it on the bottom, and it had a firing pin. You hit it and the flare would go up. And so what we were doing was taking the flare part out of that and filling it with C4, which is an explosive, and we'd pop it and it would go up and blow up, and so stupid, but we were stoned. So somebody took one of those, and there's an explosive part, and then there's a cork piece, and then your other part. So someone took one of those and took the cork part out and packed it with C4 and gave it to the sergeant major. So when he popped it, it went off and blew his hand off. So that kind of thing was not uncommon. We also had what came to be called search and avoid missions. Those of us who were out in the bush would periodically be ordered back to the main base camp to take what we called the clerks and the jerks, the base camp commandos, out on a 3-day patrol so they could qualify for having a combat infantry badge. So what we would do was we would go out and sit up under a big tree and smoke dope for 3 days and then come back, because who would want to go and get yourself killed for such a silly thing? So anyways, that was the morale in 1968, and every year beyond that it got worse and worse. There were riots in the military jails from 1960, the beginning of 1969 to the end of 1969. The number of soldiers who were in an army prison were tripled in number in 1 year in 1969. So that was one of the reasons that the war ended, because the military couldn't trust the army to do what they said. And that attitude continued on during the 1980s. One of the reasons we didn't invade Nicaragua or El Salvador was the Reagan administration still didn't trust the military. And in fact, in the Navy, there were large parts of the ships that the sailors were not allowed into in case they were going to do something wrong. One of the interesting things about the resistance in Vietnam, it wasn't the draftees who were primarily doing the resistance, it was the people who had joined the military. And then they got there and saw the reality of what the military is like. They were the ones who led the resistance. And I was going to talk just briefly about the current Iraq, Afghanistan. The amount of resistance there of that type is significantly less than it was during the Vietnam War. And so you wonder what the difference is, and there are a lot of social differences from then, 68 till now. Soldiers were single, now they're married. There's just a lot of things, but there's less resistance going on now. So one of the things I like to do is have some discussion about what we can do to engender that spirit.
I was in the Navy from 70 to 72 after all this resistance had already taken place. And it was so, the military was so disorganized, and they were trying to clean up their problems that they had notice on the bulletin board for announcing a new program in the Navy that all the guys who are on drugs come on down to the personnel office and sign up for an amnesty program, and you would either get a discharge or go to drug treatment. Discharge? And I went down there and filled in my form, and I did get out on that program. So, and I think many thousands of guys got out.
That's one of the ways the military decided to deal with the GI resistance problem, was to make it an early out available, and they got rid of a lot of the dissidents that way.
Yeah. Well, I came to talk about counter recruitment in a largest sense, because that's how you want to think about counter recruitment. The big picture on military recruitment, they're more active than ever. They're a perennial, permanent part of our society since the end of the draft. And about 4 million young people turn 18 every year in this country. And the military only needs to get about 200,000 of those to join. And even during the darkest time of the Iraq War, they weren't having a problem getting those people. They did have to relax their standards. There's about 10 strategies they use to relax their standards or to get more people into the military, which they succeeded in during the last war. I did quite a bit of counter recruitment. We founded a group called Washington Truth and Recruiting, and together with a bunch of other Veterans for Peace and so on. We went into high schools. We talked at school boards. We did made pamphlets, did a lot of activities, gradually leading up to our climax stage, which ended 3 or 4 years ago. We stopped doing this. Going to the statewide conferences of school board directors. So, there's like 300 school boards, more or less, in the state, and they all have school boards, even though they're rural or whatever it may be. And they actually, hundreds of them, anywhere between 500 and 800 in the statewide conventions that we went to come to a convention. And they all talk about school board issues. A lot of it is training themselves on the legalities of their job. But there they all are. And so we would pay the $800 or $1,000 and get a table there and hand out our subversive materials to the school boards. Getting a lot of really interesting discussions with those guys, They are pretty opinionated. But the final, point that I came to with this work, and I think that's a good place to the counter recruiting organization should do. School boards, school board meetings in your own area. Just stand up and give a 3-minute, or get involved in these statewide conventions where you can reach a lot of. And there's another one for principals and superintendents. You can get your message out. It does break the ice. It legitimizes more of a dissent among the community. It is kind of a loose community. They talk to each other. So the title of this part of my talk really is delegitimization. And that's what we need to do with regard to the military itself. And this is not a subject that people are comfortable doing, at first, but it grows on you once you grow into it, because our country has engaged in many wars since World War II. And we've killed millions and millions of people. Our country killed over 2 million people in the Korean War. Those people never attacked America. No Korean people or Chinese ever attacked America. and we unleashed the B-29 bombers, you know, with all the ordnance that was produced, and just massacred all these innocent people. And then again, the United States did this again in Vietnam, and killed, you know, the blame can go around among other countries like the North or the South Vietnamese, but 3 to 4 million people lost their lives in that conflict, and certainly none of them ever attacked America, and the U.S. had no business being there, no justification under international law. It wasn't self-defense. There was no imminent threat of any kind. They didn't even have a navy. And that war is discredited. And then we did it again in the Persian Gulf in our 2 wars in Iraq. So it's really not hard to win the argument, you know, in a short period of time with most reasonable people over whether the U.S. wars since World War II have been just or legal or moral or necessary. So there's something really strange going on in this country, why we keep having these wars over and over again. And so the second part of my talk, I'm going to just have a little fun with this diagram of the military-industrial complex. But the reason why I say it's necessary for us as older people in this country to talk about the legitimacy of the military itself and its wars is, you know, it takes a long time for a culture to change and for the doctrines that people accept to change. And somebody has to do the hard work. Somebody has to break the ice and talk and repeat quite a number of times before it starts to become acceptable to talk about in polite company, and, you know, it becomes at least part of something that people can disagree over. And of course we can go a lot farther than that once we get the permission to talk about these kind of things without being regarded as a crank or being ostracized from our communities. You know, for example, I had children in school, and I noticed the other parents wouldn't speak out because, not that they were shy, but they didn't want their kid to be bullied or ostracized. You know, so we can change that if we make it a legitimate topic to discuss whether the military is legitimate or moral. Well, basically, my point of view is that the military is completely insane. It needs to be downsized to about 10% of its present size, just to you know, guard the borders and so on. And what they've been doing is completely out of the realm of rationality or necessity.